Hi there. Welcome to the Freddie Kissoon Show with co-host Leonard Craig. Do you know the alfresco term? Do you know the Italian term alfresco? People like to dine alfresco. Alfresco means open air. So we're having an alfresco interview because there are blackouts in Georgetown and elsewhere, parts of the country. Blackouts have been plaguing this show for the longest while. So because of blackout, we are doing an alfresco show with our guest, Ravi Dev. You may not like his politics, but I think you have to concede Ravi Dev has a first-rate analytical mind. We are probing that analytical mind when it comes to the recent controversial output of Vicent Alexander. Ravi Dev and Vicent Alexander have been debating this cultural thing, this ethnic thing, for a long time on another forum. And there's no appropriate person to look at the pitfalls or maybe the strengths of Vicent Alexander's theory about African civilization in Guyana. What is the nature of the African person in Guyana? So, without further ado, I'd like to thank Leonard Craig for being here with us, and we will now hand over the forum to Leonard to pursue the Alexander theory with Ravi. Leonard?
First of all, viewers, thank you for joining us, and we welcome you. I must let you know that Vicent Alexander was invited to be on this program. So we don't want you to believe that we are chewing on his name when he's in his absence. We gave him a right of reply. He consented to be here, and then he called back to say he's not going to be here because he disliked the comments he's getting on Facebook. So he scurried. So with that in mind, we will proceed. Mr. Dev, please give us your opening thoughts. You saw Alexander's outpouring. You saw his academic thesis that he tried to foist upon us. Give us your initial feeling when you saw that program.
Before you answer that, Ravi, you've been around a long time. Those comments affect you psychologically? When you see what people say about Ravi Dev, do you say, I'm not going public anymore?
Not really. They said, Truman said, if you can't stand the heat, don't be in the kitchen. And politics in Guyana, it's a divided society, it's a plural society, call it which you may, which Vicent himself defined the society as being very plural. And in a plural society, you're also having a polarized society. Therefore, opinions about you inevitably will reflect that polarization. And I, Ravi Dev, have been the recipient of, over the 30 years since I've been involved with public affairs in Guyana, I've been at the receiving end of such comments ad infinitum. In Guyana, whether we face it or not, that is the nature of our society, and that is the nature of our politics, that it is polarized. Therefore, your opinions will elicit polarized opinions. For example, what we'll be discussing now is going to polarize a lot of people.
You're going to see comments with people saying, Ravi Dev don't know what the hell he's talking. We are not the man in the program.
Yes.
Yeah. You got to live with that.
Well, to come back what Leonard asked me about, what I understand, let me be very straight, because in my philosophy of dialogue, you must first state clearly what you understand the other side to be saying. And what I understand Vicent to be saying is that he is attempting to explain the African-Guyanese predicament. And he defines it as a predicament. Way back in 1997, Clive Thomas defined it as a plight. And there was a conference in Guyana about the plight of the African Guyanese. Plight implies a kind of a situation that is you find yourself into, and there's not much you can do about it. Problems you can resolve because problems have issues, and you can take one side or the other side. But a plight is a bit more difficult. And in terms of launching my own political career in 1999 over Channel 6, I discussed this very issue. Excuse me. But here you have Vicent Alexander in explaining what I call the African-Guyanese predicament as to where he finds himself economically, socially, politically, culturally, and any other alley you can think about, makes a statement which I found astounding. That's the only word I could use, which is that it is genetic. Africans have been fighting for hundreds of years, ever since the theory of genetics, that there's something called nurture, and going behind nature. Going behind nature, it would be your genes. To say, no, it's not genetic. It has been imposed upon us. It may be cultural, it may be the institutions around us, or what have you. But here it is that Vicent Alexander, who has been given the mandate to represent African Guyanese in Guyana through his chairmanship of IPADA G, is saying that African Guyanese are genetically damaged, and that is what is causing them to react in the manner which they do. Now, I want us to reflect on that. Now, Vicent, as he himself said, didn't invent this, but about 15 years ago, an American academic, a female, I think she was a psychologist, put out a book that put forward this theory. But that theory has been heavily critiqued, and the scientific evidence that they tried to buttress the theory with has not shown that connection that Vicent and others made. So this is not something new. So Vicent presented this theory as if somehow it's out there and it's valid. So I would like us to, hand back the chair to you to now let's discuss this theory and its strengths and its weaknesses.
Well, you want to?
No.
The ironic thing I find about Vicent Alexander's politics is, how do you reconcile his theory with his admiration for Burnham, and he's the president of an organization he founded, the Burnham Foundation. Burnham is an antithesis of the theory. Burnham, you can't say Burnham embodied a genetic defect. Burnham was suffering from post-slavery trauma. But nothing about Burnham politics was characteristic of a genetic defect. How does Alexander reconcile Burnham and Alexander's theory?
Well, in the African Guyanese community, to my great, disappointment, there are some African Guyanese leaders who attribute African accomplishment in the post-slavery era to an admixture of white and other genes. Sadly, I wouldn't call his name, he's a very respected figure, but I was shocked when this particular individual, who headed important national institutions in Guyana, who headed important constitutional office in Guyana, told me that his brightness, and they were seen as one of the brightest families in Guyana, told me that it was due to the 13% Chinese genes that their family possessed.
He's still alive?
No, that individual is not alive, but the family still is around.
But Guyanese should, Ravi, that information should be part of Guyanese history.
I've spoken about it.
You should name him.
And,
He's part of Guyanese history. You're also a historian.
Yeah.
I don't think you should let that hang in. the people should know about these names, not to delegate to the individuals, but to let people know this was part of Guyana's contemporary narrative.
Well, why I don't mention it is that this individual, to me, it was a personal idiosyncrasy. He felt like that. Coming out of Buxton, I'll give you a clue then. Coming out of Buxton, he came up with this. I guess.
Oh, I think I know. You're talking about Haslam Paris.
He came out of this.
That's Haslam Paris, yeah.
I will not deny what you're saying, but I did not say it.
In fact, I wonder, I don't want to get personal, I wonder if that theory is responsible for him having a relationship with a white.
Well, I don't want to go down that road, but to come back to it, I want to come back to Vicent theory because it's a dangerous, debilitating theory for a leader in the Afro-Guyanese community to promulgate, because he's in a position to put this out in an authoritative fashion. So rather than the African Guyanese working to resolve whatever that predicament is, and I consider, I've always said, African Guyanese are lagging. There is no question about that.
Ethnic
dilemmas and all that. So come back to it. I think it's very dangerous. That's to say it is genetic. And I don't know how much our audience will go along. I did A-level biology, physics, and chemistry. You know, back in the old days, you're bright, you're supposed to do science before I switched to, the arts. But so up to my A-level biology, what it tells you that your genes itself consists of DNA, right? Strands of DNA that's in the nucleus of every cell that we have. And that DNA cannot be changed unless, there's some very dramatic impact in terms of combining the genes from different species and what have you. Your mother and father genes combine to produce each one of us. Now, this lady's theory is called epigenetic genetic change, saying that the change in you come about because of trauma. That what can happen, let's take the Holocaust, and the theory comes out of research on the Holocaust by Jews, that they were so deprived. And there's been some other studies that comes out of famine. People have come out of severe deprivation out of famine, to show that there is some change in the genome, because what happens, you see, the DNA forms a matrix, but packing that matrix, which is like a little ribbon, between it are proteins that, in a sense, pad it. So that the proteins could change, and it can be thinner and thicker. So the expression of your DNA, the DNA is used to form other proteins. So the expression of that DNA can be altered, but it alters what is called your phenotype, your physical features. You may be short, you may be emaciated, you may be, become certain things that are physically. There has been no connection with memory, which is stored in your brain in a part called the hippocampus. There has been no connection with how memory is stored and memory may be transmitted. So what individuals are doing, and maybe they want to find out an explanation of why has the African, across the world, because it's America, this theory was put out in America, and here we are in Guyana. But it is true that in the post-slavery societies, Africans coming out of that experience have lagged. And I think, again, I want to say this, that for you to have genetic change to explain how it happened, then you will have to have genetic change to then reverse that. And since there's no connection in how it happened genetically, I don't see how you can now pin your hopes on having genetic change to reverse it. I think it's dangerous.
Alexander mentioned the village movement. Do you agree that some of the experiences of the village movement and the experiences specifically to Guyana that has caused the African typically to lag, to use your term, would you concede that nationally there is some amount of what's the term the Americans use? Affirmative action that is needed to help to restore some catching up, if that's a good term to use, of the African with the rest of you know.
But let's how do I put it? Break down some of what you have said there. The village movement. The village movement, in and of itself, disproves Vicent's thesis.
Yeah.
To wit, that here were the not. This is not 200 years afterwards. These are the slaves, children of slaves. 40,000 of which then came after even the abolition, right? No, 13,300 came, right? 40,000 came from the Caribbean. But we're saying people came directly from Africa after slavery even. So these were African individuals. The rest of the 80,000 who were here as slavery went through slavery. And the white man, without bringing up genetic theory, they presumed that the African was still that savage and nothing noble about that savage. They saw him as being going to be getting back into this savagery, and in fact would turn against them in some kind of savage rage. And that is why in 1838 the British formed a police force to police them, to literally protect the whites against them. And in the entire out of all of the police models, the British model were not armed, but the Irish model, the Irish constabulary, was armed. So when the person who went back to get the model from England chose the British model in 1838, the police force had to be delayed, the launching had to be delayed in 1839 for the input from the Irish constabulary, which was armed and which was intended to keep down a people. The Irish, let us not forget, were called white Negroes. And you were just at the cusp of the Irish potato famine, where millions died or had to emigrate to America. So that kind of police force was meant to subdue the people. And the British brought it back to Guyana here. And in fact, in every notable village, outside of the village, you had a police station. So even today, because we haven't changed it much, if you check our police stations along the coast, they were meant to subjugate the Africans, the newly freed Africans, who would then rebel. But did these people rebel? Did they go on a savage killing rage, as Vicent's thesis might have promulgated? No. They formed a most miraculous, advanced way of organizing themselves into this village movement. And in this village movement, they then allocated land among themselves, formed a village committee to run their affairs. Now, in my estimation, and with hindsight, we can see that the two of the major institutions they picked, because they agreed with the British on some premises, was the church and the school. Both of them, unfortunately, substantively had a curriculum that further enslaved the black. The church told you to look up and wait for you to get up there before you get wealthy. You understand? They didn't preach any kind of Calvinist work at get money, which is what the Americans, Pilgrim Fathers did. No, they were told here, as I think Nkrumah pointed out, or Kenyatta pointed out in Africa, to look for the hereafter, and that's where you get the thing. And what did the school do? The school taught the African to service. They didn't teach them to rule, to run things. Notice that as late as when they formed Queen's College in 1847, it was to educate their people to run things. And how did the British run things? By just having an arts background, and you then were supposed to know how Greece and Rome ruled things, to be rulers. So you did not have blacks being trained in engineering or in agriculture and all of that. So coming back to it, they formed the village movement. They had a wonderful beginning, but those two institutions, to me, in a sense, subverted and directed them away. So if we are to look into the future, unlike Vicent, rather than just looking at genetics, which I think is a ridiculous, statement, I would go back to let the black community still look back at what has the educational system done for them. My kids both went to Queens, right? As you know, they're both high flyers and they both went to Queens and all that. And this is the elite institution. And still, Queens did not teach in any way, let's say, agriculture. Agri was a subject, but it was a joke. Mm. It was never presented
compared to the arts. Yeah.
To the arts. Burnham prided himself on knowing French and Latin, right? And he would throw these Latin phrases, and he was said to be educated, and people would gasp. But did he fully understand, for example, the hydraulics, as Rodney did, in terms of how our coastline is settled? No. So I know it's been a long answer, but I want to come back very clearly. Come back to the question: the village movement disproves Vicent's thesis, and my critique, as all critiques should do, then suggests a way out of the predicament. So the way out of the predicament, and you come back to affirmative action. Now, let's take even the American model of affirmative action. In affirmative action, the Americans say you have to show a connection between a discriminatory act that puts you in that position, and then the affirmative action would correct that discrimination. And yes, in Guyana, those African fields were flooded, the canals were diverted in some cases, all kinds of reasons were given for them not to be able to become self-sufficient. So yes, we can show that. So in fact, my group that I was part of, ROAR, from the very beginning suggested affirmative action programs in agriculture and in other areas where they were discriminated against. Because let's face it, Freddie, is that today Guyana's comparative advantage that will put us ahead of the world is still agriculture. And in a world facing food security, it is not something to be laughed at and trifled with. Our oil will run out in 30 years at best, but our land is going to be here, our water is going to be here. And I think African Guyanese should be given an affirmative action. Now, take, for example, I must compliment AFC. When they went into office, they had a program, I think it's called the RAID program, RAID, Rural Agricultural Improvement, something deep. And 5 African villages were identified: Ithaca, Buxton, BV, Mocha. And I hope I get 5 there. Anyhow, and they brought machinery and they plowed up some land and cleared some land. And I think that projects like that should be built upon.
Well, let me get your thoughts on burnout. Now, when you listen to what, let's say you don't know about Guyana, somebody come from another planet, and they listen to what Vicent Alexander said on the program, on the interview that Craig and I had with him, in which he enunciated this theory of genetic affliction of African Guyanese. Would they know that African Guyanese, in the form of Burnham and his party, controlled Guyana for 28 years? How do you square what Burnham and the PNC did with this genetic defect? I'd like to know if there's a contradiction there.
Well, I think there's definitely a contradiction, but it also reveals another element in forming institutions that work against Africans and where Africans have arrived at culturally, the African Guyanese plight. I want to be explicit about this. So we have just talked about the fact that during the colonial era, Africans, Guyanese, were kept out of engineering, were kept out of running businesses, were kept out. They were simply given the civil service jobs, which were basically clerical jobs at a higher level. And it led you nowhere. You ran through the government ranks and you didn't really create anything. So Mr. Burnham, when he then took over what he called the commanding heights of the economy, you see, the mistake that Mr. Burnham made, and Chetty was going to make that same mistake if he had taken office, was to ignore the individual who they said they were imitating the teachings of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, to his credit, clearly talked about a dialectic where you start with the formation of capitalism, and that the capitalist way of creating wealth and what we would nowadays call development is unsurpassed. Unfortunately, it leads to its own contradiction, which Karl, in looking at Germany in 1848 and onwards, was then trying to rectify. But coming back to a colonial situation, where, as Rodney gave us the term, and the school from the underdeveloped school gave us the term, we were underdeveloped, meaning we couldn't produce even a bin in Guyana, right? You can't apply the theories of Karl, which is to distribute wealth, redistribute wealth, without knowing how to create wealth. And I think that was a fundamental mistake of Mr. Burnham, right? That he put the cart before the horse. He was maybe well-intentioned. He went over to, with UC, took him to Africa. He looked at the Arusha experiment from Nigeria and talked about, this whole socialist, Ujamaa socialism. So coming back to Guyana, Burnham's mistake was to take even the little bit that the British had achieved, put it into the hands of individuals who were not trained for that. With all due respect to my friend Hassan, and we were very good friends. You get me? Hassan took over and to run the bauxite company, right? Unlike Sam Hines, who was an engineer that was trained, you would find out that each of the managers could be undermined because of this socialist ideology by the boys on the floor. You understand? They formed workers groups, and these worker groups could then countermand, so they would have, so the production fell. So from being the #1 producer of bauxite, especially calcined bauxite, which is the most expensive, which you form kilns to make steel, which runs the world, we then lost that out to China. So we couldn't deliver on time because everybody was a boss. You look, Burnham took over and gave that to African-Guyanese, but he did a disfavor to African-Guyanese. So he made all of them bosses. They could work with it, they were not trained for it. Similarly, sugar. He put sugar into the hands of his African-Guyanese followers. So I come from Iceland. Tony Downs, right, who is a resource manager, was put in charge of Iceland. And just like that, every sugar estate was run down because he created another elite who just want to live high off the hog, because they were not the engineers to then push sugar further. Take, for example, at Iceland, in my boyhood, we produced white sugar. It's called plantation white sugar. You understand? Going back to my chemistry background, you burn sulfur, you form sulfur dioxide, you pass it through the sugar, and it whitens the sugar. You understand? That's when the sugar industry was destroyed. And it made black people look bad. You understand? But you put people who you didn't train to do so. So you go down to the rice industry, the same thing. You form these mills, you put it into the hands of people who you didn't train. Unlike Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew took over Singapore.
For our viewers, Lee Kuan Yew, former Prime Minister of Singapore.
He took over Singapore the same time as Burnham did Guyana. He's 63, Burnham is 64 here. And he, in fact, in his book, From Third World to First, he writes about the Caribbean politicians, that they could talk the talk, but they couldn't do anything. So what did Lee Kuan Yew do? All his bright boys, he asked for scholarships to the Western countries, gave them scholarship, and they came back as trained individuals who could run the shipyards, who could run shipbuilding, who could build. So I could go on and on, but what I'm saying, coming back to Burnham, with all due respect to the man, as I've said before, he did his best as he knew how to improve the lot of black people in Guyana, but the mistake was the ideology he chose did not. And I still see people like Vicent, talking about making money in an apologetic manner. In an apologetic manner, somehow you're not supposed to get rich. You're not supposed to make money. James Laming in 1918 is forward to Walter's book.
George Laming.
George Laming. What did I say?
James.
James. Yeah.
You know why you said James? Because Alexander Thing is on Bond, and Bond named James.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So Laming said, and he talks about the Indian willingness to make money. You understand? As a communal virtue, which is unsurpassed, which has to be, if you want to rise up, and you like it or not, in the capitalist world we find ourselves, you've got to be able to make money. And then we can talk about redistributing. And unfortunately, all of the leaders of the black community today still are kicking against what is going on here, criticizing people putting up companies and making money and investing and all of that. It's not a bad thing to make money. You gotta make money. You gotta make money.
I wish I had made some, Leonard.
No, to be frank about it, Freddie, I was able to retire at the age of 37, 1988, when I came back to Guyana and joined you as a columnist in Starbuck News. Right? I've never worked since. In the 20 years I was in America, I'm not boasting myself. I'm just telling you what the capitalist system can do if you are unbridled. And I could retire 40 years ago. Never worked since, because you could make real money. And in fact, in the same discussion I had with David Himes, there is an academic work out that shows you that when Caribbean people go to America, that first generation, they drop down their bucket and they work hard and they make it. So American blacks, you get me, are astounded by how that first generation Caribbean blacks made it. So look at where Crown Heights, where Jeffries lives. You know how that's where. That was a part of Brooklyn that, by short, Chisholm comes from there. That was built up. Chisholm had Guyanese roots, as you know. Was built up by Guyanese and other West Indians because they work hard. The problem is, as this researcher shows, the second generation took up the same rant like David and Vicent and so on, of blaming the man, and the second generation has not followed through. If you want to make money, you got to be serious enough to become seriously wealthy, and then you could free your people.
Leonard?
There is a second aspect to Vicent's outpouring, and that is the link. The word that was used was coterminous. That black leadership, Africans should follow black leadership because they are the only ones who can speak for Vicent terms, the community. How do you reconcile that in your mind? That coterminous concept with black is coterminous with PNC. If you criticize PNC leaders, you're essentially criticizing black people. And how do you reconcile that in your mind?
This is where, again, Vicent evokes a theory that has been around for a very long time. The whole question of who speaks for whom, right? And we go back to what was dubbed identity politics. That, as Brother Bob said, only he who feels knows. You understand? And Vicent is coming from that school, I would like to think. But what that does is to ossify a people into a particular time and place, which is very dangerous, because it shows a historical understanding of the passage of time. things change. People change. Well, in Vincent's case, people don't change. They're genetically fixed.
Yeah. I think that is what is dangerous about
But
this
joking aside, here again, Vicent, without, I guess, alluding to his epigenetic theory, is now saying again, who speak for you must only be from within. And you have to give a certain appreciation for that. Because, for example, in America, a fellow named Dyson, who once came, Professor Dyson, I think Michael Dyson, but he came to Guyana once and gave a lecture, but he's pretty well known in it. And this thing would be, when you're in your lived experience, you have a shared experience. Because it then orients you, because cultural transmission, you look at the world a certain way. Like me, when I came back from America to Iceland, where I had left, and we used to sleep on the floor as children, in my father's house. You didn't have a bed, you slept on the floor. But when I came back from America, you have all this wealth and whatever. I have come back here. You can't assume that you can go back to from whence you came. Things have changed. And I think this is where Vicent's statement is totally relevant. The African Guyanese community has changed to a certain extent, especially as I see it, since oil has come in. It's only 5 years, 5 short years. But in that 5 short years, I see African Guyanese turning to entrepreneurship, turning to engineering, turning to the creation of businesses at a rate and pace that is unprecedented. Again, I come back
the
to
past two chambers for the Georgian Chamber of Commerce up in Africa.
And
the past and the present.
But that's just the tip of the iceberg. I live at a level of grounded at the grassroots. I come from IFLAT, which has an African section. This girl, Tandai Mark Alistair, who is James Mark niece, I think it is, but she did come from IFLAT and all that. And so I mix in that community. I'm an old man now, but I still, visit it and I'm very grounded. That's where I grew up, in that community. So to come back to it, the young people in all these communities are changing. I come back to my kids who went to school in Queens. All of their friends, both the one who's a doctor, the one who's a lawyer, all their friends are 90% of them are African background. Because that's what all Queens was like, I guess. And when they go out and when they come back and they chat about, who they met and who they did and all that, I am amazed at this new way of thinking by this new generation that is coming up in all communities. Take, for example, the Gold Program. I once spoke socially to the guy who kept the numbers on the Gold Program. It was not the Nigerian fellow who was there. It was somebody below that, but he had the numbers. And he said, Ravi, those programs, African Guyanese are grabbing it up and taking it, outpacing Indo-Guyanese. You understand? When you look at all the training programs that are run, whether for women or for other groups, you look at it, it's in the papers being announced now. African Guyanese are grabbing it. And this is why, for someone like Vicent to say then that they must only be represented by a party that looks at the economy in a particular way, I think it's a dangerous prescription. I think those people must be free to now explore what the African Guyanese community has never explored before. Now, for my own self, coming back to this question, who speaks for whom? We have suggested, Fred, from 30 years, since we came back maybe 30 years ago, that each of these two parties, if they were smart, would imitate the American system that the PNC should have an Indian caucus and the PPP should have a black caucus.
Yeah.
I proposed this directly to Mr. Jagdeo and to Mr. Hoyt when I spoke to them. A few times I spoke to Mr. Jagdeo. But Mr. Hoyt, I had extended conversation with. And my connection to Mr. Hoyt was through Derek Bernard, and incidentally a moderator. Hoyt faced a lot of problems within the party from what he called the radicals, who we're still seeing around. But to come back to it, if we could do this, you see, we have to be attuned again to both sides being seen as tokens. And based on our history, you can't blame people for thinking historic. But if you could have, let us take it TSC, if you could have what is the name, Mahipal, Pandit Upraj Narayan, the girl who
Gita
left,
Chanda.
Gita Chandan and so on, meeting outside the party, talk about Indian concerns, and the party then, in a sense, praises them for that
And addresses
whatever, it. Yeah. But here we have a leader of the opposition, my old friend David Hines. I hope he still sees me as a friend. Calling them slave catchers, insulting them to say for denouncing somebody who
He went on this program in reference to Gita Chanda and he said, keep your mouth out of black people business.
Right. And all that those people did was to say that a particular supporter of the APA
said something.
And she's from my side, from the NAMCEL. All she put down in this. And you don't know how you speak about the other. Let me be frank about it. For example, I'm very guarded. I use the word black people because I'm used to. I come from IFLA. You get me? This is how we talk to each other. So to come back to it, I would still commend that. And Mr. Norton, I think, because I'm very concerned about the state of our opposition. Democracy can only exist if there's a strong opposition to keep whoever is in power on their toes.
Minister Bishop Edgett said that in this program.
What?
He welcomes an opposition because it keeps the government on its toes.
This innovation. If we can introduce this innovation in the PNC, I think he have scored a master stroke and may have.
He doesn't seem to be the person for that.
No, but I don't want to discount him. But I want to say that if he can do this, because he needs something that's impressive to be done. If he could do that, and then those people speak, because as I say in every program that I'm on, the Indian community people feel because the PPP is in, they're all hunky-dory behind the PPP. They're not. You know, as Freddie, from a sociological standpoint, I've spoken to you about their program before. There's something called the inverted J curve. That is not when people are being immiserized, going down, that they turn on their leaders. It's when things get better. The up curve of that J. They now begin to see possibilities and they can express themselves. So right now, I live in the Indian community. I attended a wake the last week for 5 days wake, and I spoke to these ordinary people of all age groups, and there's a tremendous dissatisfaction at the very mundane level about this one getting a contract, me getting no contract, that one getting this. You get me? Even at the mundane level, there's dissatisfaction. So the PNC cannot write off that. And I was very disappointed when my good friend Nigel Hughes, who on your program I spoke about, started out by going to Leonard Market, where he met a multiracial crowd, went back, I think, to Monaco, met a multiracial crowd. Since then, seemed to have abandoned multiracial mobilization. You get me? I don't think we could move forward in Guyana without multiracial mobilization.
It's commonsensical, Ravi.
But obviously, common sense is not that common. And because I see neither the PPP, the PNC, nor the AFC are going in that direction, and yet they're cussing out the PPP, who is moving in that direction. You see, as a Hindu, at a philosophical level, we are taught it doesn't matter what your intention is. What matters is your action. So whether the PPP wants to mama guy black people is not the issue. They very well might be. I don't know what's in their minds. Right. But their action, if they can empower black people as they're doing right now, objectively, that will set up its own dynamic that they can control, the whole dialectic that Marxists talk about. But to come back to it, I think the PNC, AFC, I dismiss it off being they're just a bunch of old fogies who ain't going nowhere. I said David is my friend, but I have to be honest. If they could get wise and have these approaches to multi-racialism, I still think some change can come.
That is what I also find surprising in the outpouring of both Hines and people like Alexander and so many others who are following, what they are saying, is that I don't find a single ounce of multiracialism in their theory and thesis and outpouring and so on. There's nothing inviting to anybody on the other side who, as you mentioned, who may have a passing discontent with the PPP. They would never see any formation with David Hines in it as a place where I can go and find comfort. And the opposition people are shooting themselves in the feet and probably hands and other parts. I think they're coming close to the head by now. And I am amazed that they don't realize that. Because how can you spew that kind of rhetoric and then expect somebody of another race or who have all their lives had a voting pattern or come from a community where a voting pattern suggests that I should follow the PPP. And because of their message and because it's one-sided, I think they're losing the very people they intend to mobilize. Because, as you say, things change.
Well, see, if I might interrupt, you see, what is even more poignant about the point you're making and the point I made for this crossover is that this is not 1980 or 92, when Indians form a majority or a close majority. We are now a nation of minorities. Therefore, logic is inescapable. You need to form coalitions. You have to reach across the divide. But no one ethnic group can put you in. No one ethnic group could put you in. So the PPP seem to have learned that lesson, and they're going out full bore, as we say in the countryside, full bore to put that into effect. But the other side is doing it, and I wonder why. I once spoke to Robert Corbyn, and I made the same point to him when we were both in Parliament, because Robert would have meetings all the time. He was opposition. I was a member of the opposition. People forget that. So I met, almost daily with members of the opposition. I sat on that side of the aisle, and I spoke about the same thing. I said, Robert, why you don't let your Indian members of the party speak up about Indian issues? And he named a particular Indian in the party who was on the upswing at that point in time. He said, man, I can tell the man, but when the man got on the stage, he more rasta than me. That's meaning he felt compelled to talk this kind of. And I see what has happened. I see recently Ganesh Mahipal has been beaten down to now echo that same line. He's now talking more about black issues than bringing up Indian issues.
And to your point, the same thing happened between 2015 and 2020. You had the more outspoken East Indians in the government were Ramjitan and Moses. And then you expect those gentlemen to echo East Indian issues and East Indian concerns. Not that you're raising racialism, but East Indians had some unique concerns that they should have echoed and reach out. And during the entire time, I did not see any reaching out. I remember I was in China, just to share. Normally we allow the guests to speak a lot, but I was in China, and I was viewing something on Facebook Live where Nagamoto went to, I think it's Rose Hall Estate, where after the sugar workers had were sent off. And he wanted to talk to them about something post estate experience or something. And PPP had a little protest on the outside telling people not to go in. And before you realize it, there were 5,000 people in there or thereabout. And they fill up that Rosal Estate ground. And they were mostly East Indian people who came to listen to what Moses had to say about sugar and so on. And I thought, yes, Moses is going to follow up on this, and Moses is going to represent the East Indian community, come back to the government, state their concern, and keep these people. But then that was just it.
Right.
That was just it. I never, and I was like, well, I normally keep my hair low, but I didn't have anything much to pull by. And I was wondering what's wrong with these people, you know. So, like you said, I can't understand the hesitancy to reach out in tangible ways to the other side. But then when the PPP on this side is trying to reach out, this nastiness is coming out. Any further explanation on what you think that configuration is leading to that kind of configuration?
But Ravi, before you come in, you were on a program, and you were on a program with Terrance Campbell. And Terrance Campbell said something which I go to write about it, to do a column on it. And when I was looking at it, I said, Ravi Dev is going to devastate this man. This man said that he could see where Hines was coming from. He could understand the mental drive, that's my term, of David Hines, because the government diabolical use of resources to win over ethnic communities. I have never heard somebody put over a government spending people's money in other areas, and that is termed diabolical.
Well, you see, I don't want to go off. Terrance and I just promised to get back on another program, and we can bring up these things because Terrance himself, a boy out of Chicago, who is the largest franchise owners in Guyana. He's a billionaire. He got to be a billionaire. He owns all these franchises, right? Nobody owns more franchises, even in the areas, than Terrance Campbell. And therefore, how did he do that when all of these things were done, against black people? Why? But the point is that I'm not going to diverge, but Terrance is to be one of the positives about him. He can be a leader to show African Guyanese what capitalism can do for them.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll come back to the question for Terrance and for my friend Nigel Hughes, and we have our own host here who can talk about it. That when I feel African Guyanese look at the predicament of the African, they seem to not want to talk about what might be called a personal responsibility. All of us know and understand, if you pass high school, about structural conditions. There's no question there are structural conditions that militate against African Guyanese because of those historical circumstances, but they can be overcome. So I think in trying not to, in a sense, blame African Guyanese, some of these very wild theories and theses are being made. And I've discussed this with David, that it started with one of our brightest economists,
Arthur
Lewis, who in 1964, after looking at the politics of West Africa, writing in that book, states, because he was now going back to be Chancellor of UG and to author our first developmental plan for Burnham, he said that upon the counting of heads, are African Guyanese to be exterminated? And I've always asked myself, why would a man from All Saints College, Oxford, use a word like exterminated for practicing democratic politics? And I think as an economist, he saw in such an economy, Africans may lag. But to me, the answer has to be that what do we do to not make them lag? We talk about affirmative action, we talk about training, and so on and so forth. So when I listen to David and see the extreme direction into which he has gone, literally foaming at the mouth, and I listen to some of the admirations of Nigel Hughes, who we have had countless conviction and conversations about these things, moving in a particular direction of so-called radicalism, I think is because
Black radicalism.
they somehow are frustrated at change, but change will take time, and they have to be willing to form institutions.
Yeah.
I spoke this morning to Swami Aksharananda, right?
How is he doing? I like that man.
He visited UC yesterday at Buxton. And two things I will share from Swamiji's standpoint. One was that UC is doing okay. He spoke about myself and so on. But the point is that in terms of the African condition, what has been done now, while Swamiji didn't say this, when he and I started out, he was one of the founders of ROAR. We talked about rural Indians not getting a top quality education apart from the 10
He's not very wealthy.
British, that's old money they used, okay? So no, let me go back then. Chumleys and so on. You told me was, I'm very good.
Yeah.
No, but to come back to it, I always come back what is to be done. I'm not a Leninist, but what is to be done? We've got to focus. And what we've got to focus is that what institutions can black leaders, including one who is sitting with us here today, and I want to put this on him. You said, the whole should do. I want to put this to you. You were sitting there with Vicent Alexander. You are an African-Guyanese who have, in a sense, left the AFC. I think you were with the AFC, and you're not in the PNC. No, I'm not so sure which party you suggest. I don't support the PPP for what it's worth. But how did you feel when you were told that you are now a damaged man who has
suffering
been
from
damaged
post-slavery trauma?
Post-trauma slave syndrome?
Mine has a genetic defect.
No.
How did you know personally? How did you share that? Because I want
I
He's the guest now.
Yes.
I cannot support that. I don't feel. I acknowledge that there were things in the village movement and post-slavery issues that have been handed down to. Handed down is a bad term, but that has been endemic in the structure of our society. That is still seating in the society that caused blacks to lag, to use your term. I would acknowledge that is so, but I cannot acknowledge that our daily experience caused these trauma or traumatic experience from that past to be born into our DNA that cause us to be unable to think quote unquote straight, that cause us to wander into support of the PPP. I cannot support that. I think people have stopped and they've seen APNU AFC in government for 5 years. They had an expectation of how APNU or PNC is supposed to respond. And I think this is just a political response to the failures, and as I outlined just now, that they saw one failure is to include East Indians better on a broader level, and the second failure is to promote Africanness or the development long-term. Indelible is the term I'm using, indelible development trajectory of the African. And they have said that, here, look, I'm making an intellectual decision to give the
we gotta go. We got a minute.
I just want to make one quick other observation. And as I wrote in a column 2 weeks ago or so, that what was keeping the PNC in power back in Burnham days was the geopolitical situation. But what almost kept the PNC in power and the APNU AFC in power in 2020 was a strictly black kind of, I don't want to use the term uprising, but there's a black support that almost kept Granger in power. That was a pure, they didn't get any international support, not even from the Caribbean. It was a pure, and that where that came from was a fear that the PPP will going to subjugate black people, right? And then PPP came into power, and blacks got to see that it is not to that extent that this thing.
We gotta go.
People
1 minute left, and Ravi, I want to ask you something because I think people looking would be interested in your answer. You did say halfway the program that you sense some disgruntlement among Indians who went awake.
Yeah.
Ravi, we're going to have you back and back and back in this program because we're entering the election campaign season. How does it look? How does it look for the opposition, for the AFC, PNC coalition? How does it look for PPP victory? How does it look?
Sadly,
1 minute.
PPP looks like it will win it, but a great part of that has to do with the disarray in the opposition camp. I cannot believe, because coming back to what that said, is that if during when they were in office, right, they blew their chances, they had it all remain, but they got that support and they could have almost pulled it off again. It means there's that core support, which they have to expand. But they haven't done anything about that, and they have alienated, even within that core support, they've alienated people. So I feel unless the opposition really gets its act together and has a new strategy, including what do you call it, the caucus, the caucus.
Yeah.
Unless they do something dramatic, I think we will win it and win it hands down.
We got to go on that score. Let me say, in case you missed it, he is saying the PPP will win because the opposition is in disarray.
Remember he used the word unfortunate. I wanted to know why, but continue.
But our time was come. We're going to have, Ravi Dev must make another 4 or 5 appearances in this program before the October election. We were broadcasting al fresco, Italian word al fresco, meaning open air, because we couldn't use the studio blackout. Our guest this evening was formidable intellectual Ravi Dev, and he was talking about the flawed theory of a genetic defect in Africans as adumbrated by Vicent Alexander. We will see you in our next program. On behalf of Ravi Dev and my co-host Leonard, please have a wonderful night. Catch you later. Bye-bye.